My favorite part of the story is when Mickey McSquizzle describes the love of his life, the woman he had left back home, of which one of her points of immaculate beauty is that she still has 6 teeth which are wide enough to fill her whole mouth when she smiles. Hello, I'm Sir Armor, and today we will be talking about an old and oft overlooked American tale called The Steamman of the Prairies. My channel here is typically dedicated to video games, however lately I've been super into the whole mech thing and decided to start exploring the genre a bit solely outside of just games. I figured taking a step back and looking at what could be the earliest possible prototype for this sort of robot science fiction mecha thing could be an interesting starting point for a full-fleshed mech noob like myself to get fully involved. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, as it would be much appreciated. Thanks. This story was written by a man named Edward S. Ellis, who under a plethora of other pen names wrote hundreds of different stories, most popular of which would have probably been his Deerfoot of the Shawnee series, which was still commonly read into the mid-century. Supposedly, Abraham Lincoln himself had a fancy for Mr. Ellis's first book, which was called Seth Jones or the Captives of the Frontier. The interesting thing about Steamman of the Prairies, or sometimes released as titled The Huge Hunter, does in fact hold the title of being the first science fiction dime novel in the United States of America. Currently, the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia retains an original copy of this dime novel. Now, what is a dime novel, you might ask? Well, there's a little bit of debate on what exactly constitutes a dime novel, though for the sake of simplicity here we're just going to generalize them as being various types and similarly priced sorts of inexpensive paper-bound story papers, serials, and reprints. It was a cheap way to entertain the growing literacy rate among the young working class of the time. I'd imagine them to be a similar scope as 1950s pulp science fiction magazines, 19th century penny dreadfuls from the United Kingdom, or maybe even modern Japanese shonen manga comics. Except, dime novels were typically pocket-sized and told tales relating to sea adventures, westerns, gold mining, railways, stories that reflected aspects of American life and culture in the time period that they were written, the 1800s. Now you could call The Steamman of the Prairies an original and prototype steampunk story, sort of Weird West tale, Edisonade, inventor adventure, whatever genre you want to call it. I think what makes the Steamman significant is that it actually is from the real time of the Wild West. It was published in 1868. Let's put that in a little bit of perspective here. This was before the word robot had even ever been thought up. That one's attributed to the 1920 play R.U.R. It was before cars or planes. The earliest car, the motor wagon, that didn't appear until 1886. It was written a few years after the Civil War ended, which would have been 1865. This was before Jules Verne published 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In terms of other super early, mecha-type stories, the notable one for the mech genre probably would be War of the Worlds with its tripod fighting machines. That one was written in 1897. The author, H.G. Wells, would have only been 2 years old when Steamman of the Prairies went public. So, to come up with the story, it's estimated that Mr. Ellis reflected upon the mass advancement of technology by the Industrial Revolution and the newly growing railway system and came up with a simple story about a sort of man-shaped train. Or maybe the previous spring he saw the real invention of a steamman by Zadok Dedrick and Isaac Grass, although that resulted in an unused patent and essentially only became a curiosity showpiece. Of course, a newspaper article about this could have definitely inspired the story we're talking about here. And back to it, having been reissued 6 times between 1868 and 1904, Ellis never did make a follow-up sequel, although a competitor, a man by the name Henry Cohen, wrote some stories about an inventor named Frank Reed. The Frank Reed stories even later incorporated steam-powered horses, fantastical airships, and electric-powered boats. It seems that the Frank Reed and Frank Reed Jr. stories had many, many more books, and probably had more legs in the pop culture of the time. As per more contemporary pop culture, it might also be worth noting that in the mid-2010s, a comic book series put out by Dark Horse Comics retold the Steam Man tale. And also, some of the Steam Man characters did end up making cameos in Alan Moore's well-known comic book series, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but they weren't in the movie. Now, before we get into an overview of the story, I'd like to make a few short anecdotes about possible controversies here. The Steam Man of the Prairies is a short story from 1868, and thereby does not conform to modern sensibilities and carries some archaic sentiments in the form of prejudice in things like Irish stereotypes, Native American depictions, as well as terminology and sayings that could be found contemporarily unpleasant. By no means do I condone these attitudes and viewpoints, but I do think that the text should be read unaltered for the sake of historical context and clarity. And also, I'm not going to be going into that much detail about any of this stuff. Just a fair warning if you decide to pick up the book and read it on your own. The story centers around the Steam Man, which functions as more of a human-shaped train than a modern robot, and its genius teenage inventor, Johnny Brainerd, who has dwarfism. Shortly after the creation of the Steam Man, Johnny meets a scalped hunter and trapper whose name is Baldy Bicknell. Baldy works out a deal to take the Steam Man on a gold hunting expedition out west. Shortly after, Johnny and Baldy start making their way towards St. Louis in a wagon that is pulled by the newly constructed steam machine. They meet up with a couple fellow prospectors, that would be Ethan Hopkins, the Yankee, and Mickey McSquizzle, the Irishman, and out west they go. From this point onward, the story kind of meanders along. They have various seemingly unrelated adventures, I guess, things like one chapter they encounter a bear, and then another chapter they do some mining, prospecting, and camping. In another chapter, at one point there's a run-in with a ne'er-do-well traveler. Finally, the story culminates in the death of the Steam Man, actually, in an explosion, during a chase with a group of Native Americans, in which the group and Steam Man chariot remain stuck in a position in a valley that they cannot cross further while retaining the robot. Overall, the story is a light and short frontier adventure tale with the premise of combined speculative fiction. Personally, in my opinion, I thought it was a bit dull and boring, but I ended up finishing the story because I thought that it was historically significant. I think if you're not really into that sort of thing specifically, you can probably just skip this one entirely outside of having the novelty knowledge, hey, that was America's first robot story.